How good is it? It's brilliant. Absolutely love it.
You guys don't need to do any work no more.
Nice. If only discernment were that simple. Well, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Byron. I'm one of the ministers here at Gungahlin Anglican Church, and it has been my privilege to be part of preparations for this service where our youth, our young people, get up and lead us in the worship of our amazing God. It is also my privilege to bring the word to you tonight. Now, Tim, who's another one of the ministers here at Gungahlin Anglican Church, and I have this thing about how he'll often ask me after he preaches, so are you going on a different track? And yes, I am today. This is going to be completely different. And I warn you because it's going to be interactive. I figured what better time to try something dangerous than when the youth are already doing the service anyway. So let's make it fun and interesting. On that though, Tim did a great job this morning relating God's care for us with fatherhood, with God as our Father. And he has offered to make his sermon notes available to anyone who is interested in them. And I encourage you to do so. He covers the topic of fatherhood from the divine perspective really, really well. I'm not doing that. I'm not saying that I'm just not going to do it well, but I'm going on a slightly different track. So our passage today, we have Isaiah 41, 8 to 20 and John 15, 9 to 17. I want to focus on the God caring part. Part of what I've had the privilege to do over the last couple of months is lead a group of people through confirmation classes. And we've been having some interesting discussions about how our faith relates to our life. So I thought it might be interesting to take a bit more of a practical, personal look at God caring for us. But first off, I want to base this out of the passage. So the way we all may have different ideas of how God cares for us. For me, I see God's care presents itself in four main ways. One is what I'm going to call provision. So that is where God supplies something. Another is protection, where God looks after us, protects us from things coming against us, whether that be physical or spiritual. The third I have called nurture, where God does things out of kindness, out of love, to delight our soul, to put a smile on our hearts. And the last one, and possibly the most important, I have called personal development. Things God does for us that make us grow. I think all four of those things are ways that God displays his care for us. In this passage, in verse 10, we see God's protection, God's strengthening, God telling him not to be afraid because he is looking after Israel. We get an image in verse 13 of God's nurturing side as he takes their hand to lead them. And I find it fascinating that he doesn't just take them in his right hand, he takes their right hand. And if you think back to ancient times, way back, look at the whole reason we drive on the left-hand side of the road, thanks to the Romans, is because weapons were held on the right hand. So if an enemy was coming, you wanted them to be to your right side. So God taking your right hand is saying that he is your weapon. He is going to be your shield. He is your defender. He is your strength. Down towards the end of the passage in verse 18, I will make rivers flow. Springs in the valleys, I'll turn deserts into pools of water. God's provision. Fruit and produce in the wasteland that was Canaan. I'll put cedar and acacia in the desert, myrtle and olive. We've heard several times today that Jupiter will land in the wasteland. Junipers, flowers. And the fir and the cypress together. And we see that all of these things, all of these aspects of God care for us are for one purpose. That is so that when people look at us and see what God has done for us, they know that it was he that did it, not us. So what I want to do now is I want to give a whole bunch of examples, I suppose testimonies if you will, of ways that I have seen and I have known of God's provision, God's care either for me or for people I know. And then I'm going to ask each of you the question, how was it that God was doing that? Was it protection? Was it provision? Was it nurturing? Was it personal development? And even more so, was it direct or indirect? Was this direct divine action of God, or was this God using somebody else as his tool? Now, sometimes some of these things may fall in multiple categories. Some may only land in one. And some may be hard to place at all. Now, those of you who know some of my history, I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were Christians. We all I've ever known is attending church on Sundays, which is not a bad thing. And when I was 9 years old, we as a family felt the call to international mission, overseas missions. And it was interesting, we did that as a family. My parents said, we feel that God is doing this thing, but we're not going unless all the three of us are in perfect agreement. So we went. And we went with a mission organisation that they call it faith-based missions. That is, people who travel with that organisation will never, ever talk about finance or need. They rely entirely on God to move people's hearts, to support them financially or in other ways. So that is the context of much of my childhood. And a lot of those examples come from that area. The first example I came with was probably an easier one, especially relating to these days. We were overseas. We needed to come back to Australia. Where my parents were due for a time of furlough, a rest period from missions, where typically when you come back on furlough, you spend 3 or 4 months running from church to church, telling people about what you're doing. And not entirely restful, aside from taking you out of the spiritual environment you're in overseas. We needed to come back. But those of you who know the history of missions across the world, Australians are financially the worst supported missionaries in the world. However, they're also the most likely to survive, to stay on the mission field beyond anyone else when it comes to support, probably because it's so far to travel. Now, we needed to come back. So we inquired with the travel agency, we worked out the dates we needed to travel, we knew exactly how much the tickets were. So we booked pending deposit. The day before we had to offer payment, a cheque arrived in the mail. When it was exchanged, it was the exact amount to the cent that we needed for those tickets. So we came back to Australia. So I asked, what kind of care was that by God? I wonder, yes, provision, direct or indirect. So was it God's direct action, or was he using others? Indirect. So weeks prior, and we found out it was actually before we'd even found the price of the ticket, God had moved in someone's heart to write a cheque for us for that purpose. And the movement of the exchange rate, that it would be the exact amount. More than once, we would be running the end of our pantry. We'd open the door in the morning and there would be a basket of groceries sitting on the porch. God's provision. When I was overseas, I was part of the Portuguese equivalent of, the simplest explanation is the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, IFES, or the Interschool Christian Fellowship equivalent brands. Brands, that's really unkind. So, bit of context, we were in a Catholic country, so the Catholics all call themselves Christians because that's what they're born into. They don't know anything different. In these Roman Catholic countries, I'm not talking about Australian Catholics, it's an entirely different kettle of fish. And I don't equate, anyway. In the city I was living in, we knew that canvassing the local evangelical churches, there weren't many, we knew of 8 Christians in my school. 8 evangelicals, 8 church-attending Protestant youth that actually attended church in my school. That school was 3,500 students. And there were 8 that we knew of that attended to church. We had a weekly prayer meeting. Now, because of some of the politics, we couldn't meet in a classroom. And they told us exactly where we could meet, being a socialist country, which was in a little area out the back of one of the buildings near what used to be the main entrance of the school, but had since been blocked off, uncovered out in the open. Now, Portugal, latitude-wise, is about Tasmania, so it rains a fair bit. We would go out each week to pray, and during winter it was raining every single time. As we stepped our foot out the door, the rain would stop. When the bell rang for the end of that recess, the rain would start again, every single time. Every single time. What kind of care is that? Provision? Protection? Nurture? Yes.
That rain could hurt you.
Direct or indirect? Direct. Very good. Nice. We're getting there. So the whole point of this is to try and get us all thinking about the situations in our own lives where, hey, maybe God's actually been doing things and I just haven't been paying attention. Or maybe opening our minds to the kind of things that God can do. When we were living there, gas was everything because the electricity was completely unreliable, but it was 9 kilo gas bottles, the same we were using for the barbecue out here. We'd have one of those which would do the stove and our hot water, and another one would run the heater. In our family, taking 3-minute showers and doing a bare minimum of cooking, a gas bottle would last 4 weeks, fairly regularly for cooking and water heating. When we had guests to stay visiting ministries, some of whom Central European teenagers who like to take 30-minute showers, the gas would always last 4 weeks. Always. We never ran short. God's care through provision, and direct care through provision. Something more closer to today. A while ago we lived on the south coast of New South Wales, and my wife was in a rather high stress work situation. The stress was quite literally killing her. I got contacted by, well, we were praying for solutions to this because my wife, she liked the business she was working for. She was working for a good employer, but the stress was just too high. So she didn't want to burn any bridges unnecessarily. Then my career manager called me and said, hey, you're coming up for posting soon. Can we have a chat? Would you like something out of the area? What have you got? He said, Melbourne. I'll take it. What is it? Unexpected provision, nurture, protection and care. And this gets even better, this story, because my wife was pregnant at the time, had been putting off the first set of scans. Till we got down to Melbourne, because we knew that it was coming up. So we got down there, did the first set of scans, and we found out that my youngest was suffering from a severe chylothorax, which is where the lymph ducts inside the chest cavity haven't closed. So the chest is filled with lymph fluid. Normally they're supposed to close early in the first late in the first trimester, and then the lungs fill the gap. So that wasn't happening. That wasn't sealing. So when you looked at the ultrasound, where his chest was, it was black, pitch black, which is supposed to be a nice spidery white thing. Anyway, so we're in Melbourne, and this happened. So at the ultrasound, so we got a referral to a specialist who just happened to be the world authority on this condition. This guy travels all around the world to teach about this condition. There is no place better in the world to be at that moment than exactly where we were. God's provision again. And then through a whole series of appointments with this gentleman, which included appointments telling us just how bad this is, how he had never seen anything that bad in the flesh before, and that we should consider whether this was a child worth having, with the complications that would occur. We had one last appointment to finally decide on a course of action. He filled the room with his students. There were 10 budding specialists in there to see this ultrasound of the single worst chylothorax that he had seen in recent time. And when they did the scan, it showed a perfect ultrasound. Absolutely perfect. People were praying around the world for this child, and he was healed in the womb against all of the odds. God cares. But God doesn't I'd have to acknowledge, though, that God doesn't always heal. This is both a blessing, a positive and a negative. That my mum is kind of like Chuck Norris. Last year she died, but she's okay now. God sent her back. And she is still continuing to fight the illness that caused that. But even in that, she sees God's care, that as we see in the Isaiah passage, that it is for a purpose. That my mother was returned because she still has something to give, a job that God wants her to do. Similarly, though, in my own life, I was told, where are we now? About 18 years ago, that I had glaucoma. Emphasis on the had. I was told that the rate that it was progressing, that without treatment I would be legally blind by my mid-30s. And with treatment, I would probably be losing my job by my mid-40s because of bad eyesight. We had a ministry visiting our church, a gentleman who God has gifted for healing. And he was asking anyone who wanted prayer for healing. And I inquired of the Lord, and I believed it was right to go up and ask for healing. I was on the most powerful medication that was available, which was not fun. It was literally like putting lemon juice in my eyes every night. And I had multiple bouts of laser surgery to release the pressure. But after that time, my last 2 lots of specialists, because Defence doesn't like to change its mind too quickly, have both said that if it wasn't for what I knew about the disease, they would never have believed that I had ever had it. I do not have glaucoma. Let's shift a gear, and I will finish shortly. Let's go with 3 that are going to be a little bit interesting. So I've already gone down the healing route. Let's go a bit more into the spiritual place. When we were back in Australia on furlough, we were staying in a respite house out in central New South Wales. I won't say where it is, but it was a nice place. It was a place for people to come back and get away from it all, spiritually speaking. There are places locally where that is available to ministers and people in ministry. And we were staying in a respite house, and while we were there, we would go off and do the meetings for furlough visit churches and things like that. And there was this one hill where, as we were going up the hill, our car would die. The engine would just like bog down, and we'd get over the hill and it'd creep down the other side and then slowly pick up as we went off into the distance. And there's one night we were going to this, what we believed was quite a significant meeting for us, and we were going up the hill and the car just stopped. It died dead. And after asking forgiveness for God for being so slow on the uptake, we prayed against what was stopping us in that time. We declared and claimed God's protection of us because of these promises in his word, where it says, I will protect you I am your right hand. We rebuked the powers that were coming against us, and we saw from heaven a beam of light. It was like a laser, like those disco lasers, but it was coming down from above. And then the car started and off we drove, and we never had a problem again on that hill. Continuing the car theme. I don't know if you've ever driven in southern Europe. It's an interesting place. There is a stretch of road in southern Portugal between the tourist town of Faro and the Spanish border, which has the single highest road toll of any road in Europe, and it's one of the highest in the world. It's in the top 10 of the world for road toll. We used to joke coming back across, we'd do trips into France and Spain, and we'd joke coming back. You could tell which ones were the Portuguese drivers because they're the ones you could see in your rearview mirror overtaking everyone, going zoom, 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 zoom. It's like watching Dashcams Australia, but all the time. That's every trip. And we had friends who were living up in the mountains, and the roads there most of them were about a car wide with overtaking spots. One day we're coming along at just below the speed limit, reaching this hairpin that was barely wider than the car, and a car full of teenagers comes the other way, absolutely flat out. There was no room for two cars there. And yet before we knew it, the car was behind us and travelling on. There was no physical way two cars could have passed that spot. None at all. And yet we did. The only solution to that is God's direct provision and protection of us. And finally, another interesting story. A fellow missionary of ours, a fellow Australian, Janet, her name was. She was teaching scripture classes in the locals. She managed to get, because it was mandatory to include religious education, being a Catholic country, and there was no rules preventing, like I said, any denomination could come and give it. One of the few benefits of a socialist country, but couldn't get a classroom to do it, so she'd take the kids up to the local football field, because every village has a soccer field in Portugal. It can be a 10-house village, it'll have a soccer field. And she's there teaching a class of about a dozen students, and the local school teacher, headmaster, brings her class up to where they're meeting on the oval with rocks to stone them because they're the wrong kind of Christian. So Janet fires off one of those, we used to say arrow prayers, God help, tells the kids, just ignore them, and she keeps teaching the lesson. And like a lovely situation where Jesus waits while writing in the sand, one by one the children dropped their rocks and left, starting with the teacher. But some children stayed and then kept coming back. Example after example of where I have seen in my life and the lives of others God's undeniable care. Undeniable. Whether it be protection, whether it be provision of need, whether it be granting the desires of our hearts.